Rain fell hard that night, slashing against the tall glass of the Marcelli Corporation tower like shards of silver. Inside, chandeliers gleamed over polished marble floors, where men in expensive suits and women in glittering gowns mingled, their laughter echoing through the grand lobby. It was the company's 50th anniversary. A night meant for celebration, champagne, and the illusion that the world outside didn't exist. But somewhere beyond the music and the polite applause, a quiet figure mopped the far end of the corridor. His name was Elias. No one noticed him. No one ever did. His uniform was faded, his shoes squeaked, and his mop glided rhythmically across the marble as if he were performing a forgotten waltz. Every so often, his eyes lifted toward the massive piano on the stage. A Steinway grand, black as night, gleaming like a mirror. He paused for a second, just watching it, lost in the way its lid reflected the chandelier's golden light. His fingers twitched slightly, unconsciously mimicking the curve of the keys. Then he lowered his head again and continued mopping. At that very moment, the CEO of Marcelli Corp., Victoria Langford, took the stage. She was elegance wrapped in authority, every movement precise, every word crisp. "Tonight," she began. Her voice amplified across the hall. "We celebrate 50 years of innovation, perseverance, and the people who made this empire what it is." Applause followed, camera flashes, polite smiles. But in the sea of suits and sequins, Victoria's eyes were tired. She had built her company from the ashes of her father's failures, sacrificing youth, love, and perhaps something even deeper along the way. Then she added, with a smile that felt almost rehearsed, "And as a little surprise to mark this special night, I will grant." Audience buzzed. "A wish?" someone whispered. Victoria nodded. "Yes. A challenge, if you will. I'll marry whoever can move me, with music." Laughter rippled through the crowd. A few men raised their brows, a few women rolled their eyes. But Victoria only smiled faintly and turned toward the grand piano. "Play Chopin," she said softly. "If you play Chopin, and make me feel something again, I'll marry you." The room went still. Everyone knew Victoria's reputation: cold, brilliant, untouchable. Her words sounded more like mockery than invitation. No one dared take the stage. Until a soft clatter echoed from the back of the hall. A mop handle slipping from calloused fingers. Heads turned. Elias stood frozen, caught in the glow of the chandelier. His face flushed red as the CEO's piercing eyes met his from across the room. "Did you drop something?" one of the waiters whispered, snickering. But Victoria's gaze lingered. "You there," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. "Come closer." The guests watched with disbelief as the janitor, this quiet, middle-aged man in a faded uniform, walked toward the piano. His steps were hesitant, his breath shallow. When he reached the stage, Victoria tilted her head, intrigued. "You heard what I said, didn't you?" "Yes, Mom." Elias replied softly. His voice was low, but it carried. "You think you can play Chopin?" she asked with a faint smirk. "I can try," he said. Laughter broke out among the audience. Someone whispered, "He's out of his mind." Another chuckled, "Maybe he'll clean the keys first." Victoria held up her hand, silencing them. "All right," she said, folding her arms. "Play." Elias hesitated. The room's attention pressed against him like weight. He reached out, fingers trembling, brushing the ivory keys as if greeting an old friend. The first note came hesitant, thin. Then another, and another. A phrase began, halting, uneven, until the melody of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major began to take form. But something shifted. As Elias played, his posture straightened. His hands, rough and scarred from years of labor, moved with growing confidence. The notes flowed like whispered memories, weaving a story too tender for words. The laughter faded. The conversation stilled. Victoria's eyes softened, just slightly. Something in the way he played, the vulnerability, the restraint, the ache, pierced the wall she'd built around her heart. She saw, suddenly, flashes of her past. Her mother's laughter by a piano, her father humming to Chopin on stormy nights before everything fell apart. Elias didn't look up. He played as if he were alone. As if the marble and glass and silk didn't exist. Just him and the ghost of something he'd lost long ago. When the final note trembled and faded into silence, no one spoke. The janitor lifted his hands from the keys and stood quietly. His eyes glistened with something he didn't hide. Victoria stepped forward slowly, her heels echoing against the marble. Who taught you that?" she whispered. "My wife," Elias said softly. "Before she died." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Victoria blinked, her throat tightening. "And you played for her?" "Every night," he said. "Until She couldn't hear anymore. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The room had forgotten its laughter. The storm outside had softened to rain. Victoria looked at him. Not as a CEO gazing at a janitor, but as a woman standing before a man who had somehow reached the one place she'd locked away for years. And then she whispered, barely audible. "You made me feel something." Elias nodded. "Then that's enough." He turned to leave, picking up his mop again, while the world watched in silence. Victoria's voice broke the air. "Wet." He stopped, turning his head slightly. Her eyes shimmered with something unspoken. "Who are you really?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "Just the janitor, ma'am." The music was over, but the story had just begun. The gala ended hours later, but Victoria Langford remained in the empty ballroom, staring at the grand piano as if it had just told her a secret she couldn't unhear. The rain outside had eased into a drizzle, tapping softly against the glass. The chandelier lights dimmed one by one, until only the faint glow above the stage remained. She sat where Elias had once stood, her fingertips resting on the keys he'd touched. His music still echoed in her mind. Haunting, imperfect, yet more human than anything she'd heard in years. She thought she'd buried that part of herself. The part that used to feel. A knock broke her trance. "Ma'am." It was Charles, her long-time assistant, peeking through the door. "It's past midnight. The guests are gone. Should I call your driver?" Victoria didn't answer immediately. "Charles," she said finally, "the janitor who played earlier? Elias, was it?" "Yes, ma'am. Elias Ward. Works the night shift. Been here nearly 10 years, I believe." 10 years. She repeated softly. "And I've never noticed him." Charles gave a polite shrug. "He's very quiet, keeps to himself. The cleaning staff says he hardly talks." Victoria stood slowly, adjusting her coat. "Find him. Tomorrow morning. I want to see him." Charles blinked, uncertain if she was joking. But the look in her eyes told him she wasn't. "Of course, ma'am," he said with a nod. As she left the ballroom, her reflection in the glass caught her off guard. She looked tired, older, as if one song had stripped away years of pretense. Down in the maintenance corridor, Elias rinsed his mop bucket under a flickering light. His hands were still trembling. Not from nerves, but from the aftertaste of music. It had been so long since he'd touched real ivory. The notes still vibrated somewhere deep in his bones. "Hey, Mastro." The voice belonged to Ben, another janitor. Younger and perpetually curious. "Man, I didn't know you could play like that. You just silenced an entire room of millionaires." Even Victoria Langford looked like she'd seen a ghost. Elias smiled faintly. "It's been a while." Ben leaned against the wall. "You seriously played Chopin for her?" "I didn't play for her," Elias said quietly. "I played for someone else." Ben nodded slowly, the teasing fading from his face. "Your wife, right?" Elias didn't answer, but his silence said enough. They finished cleaning in near silence. When Elias finally stepped out into the cool night air, the city lights shimmered against puddles. He paused for a moment, looking up toward the 40th floor. The CEO's office, where light still burned faintly through the rain-streaked glass. He didn't know why she'd made that strange challenge. Maybe she was lonely. Maybe she was testing people. But for one brief moment, he had seen something in her eyes. A flicker of pain that mirrored his own. Then he turned and began the long walk home. The next morning, Victoria arrived at her office earlier than usual. She didn't touch her coffee. She didn't look at her emails. Her mind was still on that melody. Its restraint, its heartbreak. Charles entered quietly. "He's here, ma'am. Send him in." Elias stepped through the glass doors, his uniform freshly pressed but still faintly worn at the seams. He looked around awkwardly, dwarfed by the sheer size of her office. Its shelves lined with awards, its walls covered in abstract art that screamed of wealth and taste. "Good morning, ma'am," he said softly. Victoria gestured to the chair opposite her desk. "Sit, please." He hesitated before doing so. "You've been working here 10 years," she began. "And I've never heard your name. How did that happen?" Elias smiled faintly. "You don't usually notice the people who clean your floors." Her lips twitched, almost into a smile, but not quite. "You're right. And that's my fault." She leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, where did you learn to play like that?" Elias looked down at his hands. "My wife was a piano teacher. We met at a community center. I fixed things there, leaky pipes, broken lights. She used to practice every evening, and sometimes I'd listen from the hallway. One day, she told me, 'Don't just listen. Sit beside me.'" He smiled faintly, lost in the memory. That's how it started. And after she passed? Victoria asked softly. He hesitated. I stopped playing. I sold her piano to pay for the hospital bills. Thought I'd never touch one again. The room fell quiet. The hum of the city far below filled the space between them. Victoria's eyes softened. But her voice stayed steady. You said something last night. Then that's enough. What did you mean? Elias looked up at her, his gaze calm but heavy. I meant that I didn't play to impress you, ma'am. I played because it felt like she was still listening. Oh, for a moment, Victoria couldn't speak. She turned toward the window, blinking rapidly as if the city lights might disguise the emotion building behind her eyes. Finally, she said, Elias, I don't make offers twice. But I'd like you to do something for me. What's that? I want you to teach me to feel music again. Elias blinked, uncertain he'd heard correctly. Mom, I'm just a janitor. Victoria shook her head. Last night, you were more than that. You were the only person in that room who was real. Elias hesitated, searching her expression for mockery. There was none. He exhaled slowly. All right, he said at last. But on one condition. Her brows rose. A condition. He nodded. If I teach you, then you have to promise not to play for anyone else. Not for the board. Not for your parties. Just for yourself. For the first time in years, Victoria Langford smiled, a small, genuine smile that reached her eyes. Deal. Outside, the city stirred awake, unaware that something fragile and extraordinary had just begun in the top floor of Marcelli Tower. The first lesson took place that Friday evening. Victoria dismissed her staff early, turned off her phone, and waited in the dimly lit music room of her penthouse. An elegant space dominated by a grand piano that hadn't been played in years. The city stretched out beneath the glass walls, glowing like a field of scattered embers. Elias arrived exactly on time, carrying nothing but a small notebook and the quiet calm that always seemed to follow him. He stood at the door, unsure whether to step in. You really live above the clouds, he murmured. Victoria gestured toward the piano. It's quiet up here. Easier to think. He smiled faintly. Sometimes quiet can be too loud. She tilted her head, intrigued. You speak like a man who knows silence well. I do, he said simply. For a moment, they stood facing the instrument, its polished surface reflecting their two contrasting worlds, her in tailored perfection, him in modest simplicity. Then Elias nodded toward the bench. Sit. Victoria obeyed almost reluctantly. Her hands hovered above the keys, uncertain. Close your eyes, Elias said softly. She frowned. Why? Because music doesn't start with sound, he replied. It starts with listening to what's inside. Reluctantly, she closed her eyes. Elias's voice lowered, calm and deliberate. What do you hear right now? After a pause, she said, the hum of the city. The wind, my own breathing. Good, he said. Now, underneath all that. What else? She hesitated. Nothing. It's empty. Then start there. Elias murmured. That's where music lives. He placed his hand gently over hers, guiding her fingers to a simple chord. The warmth of his skin startled her. It was rough, calloused, but steady. Now press. The piano responded with a soft, hesitant note. Victoria's lips parted slightly. It feels alive. It is, Elias said. Every note has a heartbeat, but only if you believe it does. They began slowly. Elias taught her to breathe with the rhythm, to let the keys respond instead of command them. She stumbled, cursed once, then laughed, really laughed. For the first time in months. Elias chuckled too, shaking his head. You sound like me the first time I tried to fix a faucet. The hours slipped by unnoticed. The skyscrapers outside turned to silhouettes, their lights flickering against the dark sky. At one point, Victoria stopped mid-note. How do you make it sound like that? Like you're remembering something. Elias took a deep breath. Because I am. He moved beside her and began to play. Not Chopin this time, but something simpler, older, something his wife had loved. The melody filled the room with quiet sorrow and unspoken tenderness. Victoria watched his face in the dim light. His eyes were closed, his expression both pained and peaceful. When he finished, the silence that followed felt sacred. Was that hers? She asked softly. Yes, he said. She wrote it. Said it was unfinished. I tried to complete it after she passed. But I couldn't. Why not? He looked at her, the faintest trace of grief in his eyes. Because some things aren't meant to end. For a moment she couldn't speak. Then, very quietly, she said, you must have loved her deeply. Elias smiled sadly. I still do. Victoria turned back to the keys, her voice barely a whisper. I used to think love was a distraction. My father lost everything because he couldn't separate feeling from business. I swore I'd never let emotions rule me. And did it make you happy? Elias asked gently. She hesitated. It made me successful. He nodded. But not alive. The words landed like truth she'd been avoiding for years. Her throat tightened, but she forced a smile. You're a philosopher for a janitor. He chuckled softly. Or just a man who's had too much time to think while scrubbing floors. The night deepened. When Elias finally stood to leave, Victoria surprised herself by saying, same time next week. He nodded. Only if you promise to practice. I don't break promises, she said. As the elevator doors closed behind him, Victoria remained at the piano, pressing a single note and letting it linger. It didn't sound perfect, but it sounded real. 2 weeks passed. Their lessons became a quiet ritual. Friday nights filled with hesitant laughter, spilled tea, and notes that grew smoother each time. Elias never asked for payment. Victoria never offered. There was a strange balance between them. 2 lives stitched together by sound. One evening, as she played through a passage of Chopin's Prelude No. 4, her hand faltered. It feels too heavy, she said in frustration. Like I'm dragging the music down. Elias walked behind her watching. You're thinking too much. You're trying to control it. I am in control, she said, her voice sharper than she intended. He shook his head. That's the problem. She looked up, meeting his calm, unwavering gaze. And what would you know about control, Elias? You clean floors for people like me. The words escaped before she could stop them. Silence followed, thick, painful. Elias's face didn't change, but his eyes darkened slightly. You're right, he said quietly. I do clean floors. But I also learned that some things can't be polished by power. He turned toward the door, his footsteps heavy. Elias, wait, she began, but he raised a hand. Next time, he said softly, play because you want to. Not because you need to win. And then he was gone. Victoria sat there, the weight of her own words pressing against her chest. She looked down at the piano. The same one that once made her feel alive. And for the first time since their lessons began, it looked like a stranger. She pressed a single key. The sound was hollow. Somewhere deep inside her, she realized she hadn't been trying to learn music. She'd been trying to feel worthy of it. Outside, the city lights flickered against the rain once more. Just like that first night when a janitor had silenced an empire with a song. And now, she wondered if she had just silenced something inside him. The next week, Victoria couldn't focus on anything. Meetings blurred together, voices from the boardroom felt distant, muffled. The numbers on her laptop meant nothing. Every time she looked out the window, her reflection seemed to ask the same silent question. Why did you say that? She hadn't seen Elias since that night. He'd stopped responding to her messages, and the absence of his calm presence gnawed at her more than she cared to admit. The piano in her penthouse sat untouched, its keys gathering dust like a monument to her guilt. By Thursday, she finally gave in to the weight of her own conscience. Late that evening, she slipped out of her office, took the service elevator down to the maintenance floor, and followed the faint echo of a mop bucket rolling down the hall. The janitorial wing smelled faintly of bleach and old coffee. Elias was there, quietly sweeping near the storage room. His back was turned, but he seemed to know she'd come. I was wondering how long it would take, he said softly, without looking up. Victoria froze. Elias. He straightened, leaning on his broom. You don't usually come down here, Miss Langford. Her throat tightened. I said something cruel. He met her gaze, calm but guarded. Yes. You did. I didn't mean it the way it sounded, she said quickly. It was reflex. I get defensive when she paused, searching for the word, when I start to feel. Elias studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. You've spent so long being in control that feeling must look like failure to you. Her voice dropped to a whisper. You're not wrong. He smiled faintly, though his eyes remained sad. Apologies are easy, Victoria. Change is harder. She took a step closer. Then help me change. That made him pause. Why? Because you were right, she said. All my life I've been measuring everything. Profit, loss, progress. But I've never learned to measure meaning. And for a moment, when I played beside you I almost did. Silence stretched between them. The hum of a vending machine filled the space. Finally, Elias set the broom aside. Come upstairs. There's something I want you to see. Told you, they rode the service elevator in silence, emerging onto the rooftop parking deck. The city sprawled beneath them, the wind tugging gently at their coats. The night was unusually clear, the skyline glittering like constellations made of glass. Elias pointed to a small, weathered door near the maintenance shed. "I keep something here." Inside was a tiny break room, barely large enough for 2 chairs and a small upright piano pushed against the wall. Its surface was scratched, its keys yellowed with age, but it was tuned perfectly. "You kept this here?" Victoria whispered. Elias nodded. "Couldn't bear to throw it away. It was the piano from the community center where I met her." Victoria's eyes softened. "The one your wife played?" "Yes," he said quietly. "They were going to scrap it. I asked to take it. I fix it up sometimes when no one's around." He sat down on the bench and patted the space beside him. "No suits. No boardrooms. Just this." She hesitated, then joined him. Elias began to play a simple waltz, nothing grand, nothing meant to impress. The melody was plain human. After a moment he nodded for her to join in. Her fingers trembled at first, then steadied. Together, they filled the cramped little room with warmth. When the piece ended, Victoria leaned back, exhaling deeply. "I can't remember the last time I felt this light." "That's music's trick," Elias said. "It doesn't fix you. It just reminds you that you're not broken." She turned toward him. "You speak like someone who's made peace with everything." He smiled faintly. "I haven't. But I've learned to stop fighting what I can't change." There was a long pause. Then Victoria asked, almost afraid of the answer, "Did you ever think of falling in love again?" Elias looked down at his hands. "No. Love like that doesn't come twice." Her chest ached at the simplicity of it. "But what if it's not about replacing what you lost?" She said softly. "But finding something new. Something different." He glanced at her, and for a brief, unguarded moment, the air between them shifted. The city lights flickered across their faces, painting them in silver and shadow. Then Elias stood, breaking the moment before it could settle. "It's late. You should get some rest." She wanted to protest, to tell him she didn't want the night to end, but instead she nodded. "Thank you," she said quietly. He smiled, but his eyes carried that same deep melancholy. "Keep practicing, Victoria. One day, you won't play like someone trying to remember. You'll play like someone who's finally let go." That night, Victoria couldn't sleep. She lay awake staring at the ceiling, the echo of his music threading through her mind. By morning, she made a decision. When Elias came to work the next evening, the grand lobby was closed off. Covered in scaffolding and dust sheets. A handwritten sign hung from the piano's lead, "Do not remove." He frowned, then turned as Victoria appeared behind him. She was in simple clothes, no jewelry, no makeup, just a quiet determination in her eyes. "What's going on?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "You once said some things can't be polished by power." "Wes." "Well," she said, glancing at the piano, "maybe they can be restored by humility." He blinked, puzzled. "I'm having this piano moved," she continued, "to the lobby, permanently. For anyone who wants to play it, staff, janitors, guests. Music shouldn't belong only to the rich." Elias's lips parted slightly, then curved into the faintest smile. "You're serious?" "I am," she said. "And I want you to play the first note." The storm of disbelief and quiet pride in his eyes said more than words ever could. He nodded once, slowly. "All right. But not yet." "Why not?" He looked toward the distant horizon, where dawn was just beginning to bleed into gold. "Because the best songs," he said, "need time to be written." Victoria didn't fully understand what he meant. But something in her chest stirred again. The same spark that had begun the night she first heard him play Chopin. Only this time it wasn't curiosity, it was hope. The grand piano, once a silent showpiece under glass, now sat openly in the lobby. At first, employees walked past it, unsure if they were even allowed to touch it. Then one morning, a receptionist pressed a few shy notes before work. A week later, a courier played a full melody while people listened during their coffee break. It became a ritual. A quiet, human heartbeat in a building of polished steel and ambition. Victoria watched it all unfold from her glass office high above. She no longer measured her company's worth in quarterly reports alone. For the first time in years, she was listening. Not just to music, but to the quiet stories that lived within her walls. And yet, amid that slow rebirth, one presence had become painfully absent. Elias hadn't been to her penthouse for lessons in weeks. He still worked nights, She'd catch glimpses of him through security footage or the reflection of a freshly mopped floor. But he kept his distance. Polite, professional, distant. Every time she saw him, something in her chest ached. One Friday evening, unable to bear the silence any longer, she found herself walking down to the maintenance corridor again. The air was heavy with the scent of disinfectant. The hum of old fluorescent lights filling the hallway. Elias was there, sitting beside the vending machine, his mop resting nearby. He looked tired. More so than she remembered. "Elias," she said quietly. He looked up. "Miss Langford." "Victoria," she corrected gently. "Please." He nodded but didn't speak. She hesitated, then said, "You've been avoiding me." He smiled faintly. "Not avoiding. Just giving space." "I don't want space," she said. The words came out sharper than intended, but her voice trembled. "You said the best songs take time to be written. Has mine been written yet?" Elias looked at her for a long moment before replying. "It's close." "Then play it for me," she whispered. He exhaled, standing slowly. "All right." To two, they went to the rooftop again. The same cramped break room, the same old upright piano. But this time, the night air was different, softer. The city below seemed to breathe with them. Elias sat, hands poised over the keys. "I finished it last week," he said quietly. The song she started. Victoria's breath caught. "Your wife's." He nodded. "But now it's not just hers anymore." He began to play. The melody unfolded like dawn through fog, gentle, uncertain at first, then rising with quiet strength. Each note carried pieces of both sorrow and forgiveness, of endings that led to beginnings. Victoria closed her eyes, letting the sound fill her completely. It wasn't Chopin. It wasn't perfect. But it was alive. Halfway through, Elias's fingers faltered slightly. His breathing grew uneven. "Elias," she whispered. He didn't stop playing, but his hands trembled. His skin looked pale in the dim light. When the final chord faded, he leaned forward, resting his hands against the keys. "Are you all right?" Victoria asked, concern flooding her voice. He nodded weakly. "Just tired. Been working double shifts. You shouldn't push yourself like that." He smiled faintly. "I've pushed through worse." But she wasn't convinced. "You need rest, real rest. You don't look well." He waved her concern away, but when he stood, his balance wavered slightly. Victoria caught his arm. "Elias." He steadied himself with a breath. "I'm fine," he said softly. "Just dizzy. It'll pass." She looked at him. Really looked. And saw it then, the exhaustion that ran deeper than work. The faint tremor in his hands that he'd tried to hide for weeks. "Elias," she said gently, "what's happening?" He hesitated, then met her eyes. "The doctors call it cardiomyopathy. My heart's been slowing down." Her stomach dropped. "How long have you known?" "A while," he said simply. "It's manageable, for now." "For now," she repeated, her voice breaking. "Why didn't you tell me?" He smiled faintly. "Because you started to play again. That's all I wanted to see before it gets worse." Tears welled in her eyes. "Don't say that. Don't you dare say that like it's already over." He reached out, brushing a tear from her cheek with the back of his knuckle. "Victoria, I've lived a good life. I've loved once completely, and somehow, I got to see someone else rediscover what that love feels like. That's enough." She shook her head, choking on her words. "No, it's not enough. You can't leave this unfinished." Elias looked at her with that same steady calm that had first silenced the ballroom. "Not everything needs finishing. Some songs are meant to be passed on." Her lips trembled. "Then let me carry it for you." He smiled through the pain, a tear glistening on his cheek. "You already are." They stood there in silence, the night stretching wide and endless around them. The piano glimmered faintly in the moonlight. Victoria wanted to speak, to promise him she'd fix it, she'd find some way to keep him here. But the words wouldn't come. So instead, she sat beside him and began to play. Slowly. Hesitantly. The same melody he'd written. The notes wavered, imperfect. But filled with the kind of emotion she once feared. Elias closed his eyes and listened, his breathing steadying as if the music itself was keeping him alive. When the final note faded, he whispered, "That's it." She turned to him. "That's what?" "The sound of letting go." He smiled once more, gentle, peaceful. And then leaned back against the wall, closing his eyes. For a heartbeat, everything went still. Then the wind swept through the open window, carrying the faint echo of the last chord into the night. Victoria froze, her hand still on the keys. "Elias," she whispered. But he didn't answer. The city below kept breathing. The piano stayed warm beneath her fingertips. And somewhere in the quiet space between one note and the next, Victoria felt something break, and something else begin. The world did not stop the night Elias Ward died. The city still pulsed with its neon heartbeat, and the Marcelli Tower still rose like a glass blade cutting through the clouds. But for Victoria Langford, time fractured into two parts. Before the rooftop piano and after. The next morning. She didn't arrive at the office. She sat in her penthouse beside the piano, staring at her reflection in the black lacquered lid. The news from the hospital had been gentle but final. His heart had simply stopped. Peacefully, they'd said. As if peace were something she could believe in anymore. On the bench beside her lay a worn leather notebook. Elias's. Someone from the cleaning staff had found it in his locker. Its pages were filled with music. Unfinished melodies, handwritten notes. Fragments of poems, even sketches of the old community center, where he'd first met his wife. Near the end, one line was written twice, underlined so hard that the paper had nearly torn. If you play Chopin, I'll marry you. Victoria traced the words with her fingertips. Beneath them, in smaller, uneven handwriting, Elias had added she never got to finish that song. Maybe someone else will. Tears spilled silently onto the page. A week later, the grand lobby of Marcelli Tower was filled again. But this time there were no chandeliers or champagne glasses. No cameras, no laughter. Just employees, friends, and strangers who'd once walked past a quiet janitor without seeing him. A single photo rested atop the Steinway Grand. Elias, in his faded uniform, smiling faintly beside a mop. Victoria stood before the piano, dressed in black. Her voice, though calm, trembled with every word. Most of you remember Elias as the janitor. Some of you remember the night he played Chopin and silenced us all. But very few of you knew who he really was. A man who carried more music in his heart than most of us ever will in a lifetime. The room was utterly still. She glanced at the piano. He taught me something I should have known long ago. That power means nothing if it can't move the human soul. And that music, like kindness, belongs to everyone. Not just those who can afford it. Her hand brushed the keys, and the soft sound lingered in the air. So today, she continued, her voice thickening, this piano stays here, for anyone who needs it. For the tired, the unseen, the unheard. For Elias Ward. She paused. And for the love he never stopped sharing, even when no one was listening. Then she sat at the piano and opened the worn notebook to its final page. The room seemed to hold its breath as she began to play. The melody was his, unfinished. But she completed it, each note trembling with the weight of memory. It rose gently, like light breaking through grief. And by the time she reached the final chord, there wasn't a single dry eye in the hall. When the music ended, silence reigned, not empty, but sacred. And then, slowly, one by one, people began to applaud. Not out of politeness but gratitude. In the months that followed, something remarkable happened inside Marcelli Tower. Employees who had once hurried past the janitors now stopped to talk. The piano became a sanctuary. A place where stories were told through melody instead of meetings. Sometimes a security guard played blues during the night shift. Sometimes a cleaner hummed lullabies while polishing the floors. The music spread, gentle and unstoppable. Victoria changed too. She began leaving her office door open, holding fewer meetings. Spending more time downstairs. She even took to teaching, showing others the chords Elias had taught her, the way he'd spoken about silence, breath, and feeling. One evening, as the sun melted over the skyline, she returned to the rooftop room where it had all begun. The little upright piano was still there, slightly out of tune, a faint trace of dust on its keys. She sat down and opened Elias's notebook again. The pages rustled softly in the wind. There, tucked between two sheets of music, was a folded letter. One she hadn't noticed before. Her heart skipped as she unfolded it. His familiar handwriting spreading across the page. Victoria, if you're reading this, it means the song finally found its ending. I used to think my music died with her, but I was wrong. It just waited for the right listener. You once said love was a distraction. Maybe it is. But if it can distract us from pain, from pride, from the noise of the world, then maybe that's the only kind worth having. When you play, don't chase perfection. Chase honesty. The world already has enough noise, what it needs is truth. So play, Victoria. Not for me, not for anyone, for yourself. Her vision blurred as she folded the letter back into the notebook. For a long moment, she simply sat there, her hands resting on the keys. Then, with a deep breath, she began to play Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. The same piece that had changed everything that first night. But this time, it wasn't hesitant or careful. It was alive. Her fingers flowed over the keys, unrestrained, free. The notes rose into the twilight air, spilling through the rooftop and out across the city. Below, the workers on the night shift paused to listen. Someone whispered, "That's her." Someone else murmured, "That's his song." And in that moment, it didn't matter who owned the tower, who cleaned it, who ran it. The music bound them all together in something wordless and pure. As the final notes faded, Victoria whispered softly into the empty room, "You were right, Elias. Some songs aren't meant to end." The wind stirred, carrying the faint scent of rain and the echo of a single, gentle chord. Like a heartbeat somewhere far away, still keeping time. Outside, the city lights shimmered in rhythm,